Hey, my name's Nate. Today I want to talk about something that's normally considered pseudoscience in investing. And this is the strategy called dividend capture. Now, there's usually not a very sound way to do this, but I do believe this particular method checks out and it requires holding the particular stock or ETF you're using in this instance long term, and it involves very, very, very short term uses of margin. And what this can do is it can allow whatever dividend you would normally get by holding an ETF or a stock, whichever, it can put a very small multiplier on your dividend so that you're using short term margin to increase the amount of dividend you're getting each time there is one. And what this allows is you're basically paying back the margin immediately with the excess dividend, and you're capturing a little bit more profit than you would otherwise. And of course, you can always just use long term margin, but then, of course, you're increasing your risk. And so that's why this is a dividend capture strategy rather than just using margin with high yield dividend ETFs, which you can do regardless, and it's not really dividend capture in that regard. So how the math works basically. So this, I'm just using MSTY as my um, instrument. Currently, MSTY per share is $17.86 according to Google Finance. The most recent dividend according to Seeking Alpha is $1.18 and a little bit of change after that. And we're just going to play around with this. If you start out with only 50 shares, the dividend that you're going to get, now we're assuming, by the way, that you are going to buy the amount of shares you could get if you dripped once they announce what the dividend will be. So with Yield Max, I believe they normally announce on a Tuesday or Wednesday. They do the ex-div, I believe, on Thursday, which means you have to have bought before then. And then on Friday, they issue the payout, usually, for the main tickers. Some Yield Max funds do it differently, I believe, but this is the main way it does. So what you would do is when they announce, so for instance, they're going to tell you, let's assume instead of the most recent dividend being this, let's say that this is the dividend that's upcoming. So $1.18 is the upcoming. So if you just let that just pay out with your 50 shares, you're going to get a dividend of $59.17 or so. If you put that back into your amount of shares that you have, if you turn on drip and just let that reinvest automatically, you're going to get about 3.31. Now it's not exact because I'm using the same price, so I should probably include in my math that the dollar dividend is going to be siphoned out of that NAV. But that's just a little bit of adjustment. You'll probably actually get more shares with that dividend since the $17 will have this subtracted out, because that's how YieldMax does dividends. So in any case, if you purchase on the announcement with margin, so this is before the dividend has paid, you're basically buying the equivalent of what the dividend could drip. And what you're doing is you're just putting that in so that you can get a little bit of a multiplier on your dividend. So the new total shares you'll get when the dividend does hit is now, instead of 50 shares, it's now going to be 53.31 shares. So your dividend before was $59.17. Now after your dividend hits, it's going to be $63. And the margin that you're going to use is going to be $59. Now I use the highest margin that I could find. I don't know if this is actually the highest margin rate around, but E-Trade does 12.7% for retail margin rates. And so the formula is this is the percentage of the APR, and you're going to divide that by 360 because of the amount of days in the year. And then you're going to you get this as the per day interest rate. So then what you do is you multiply this times whatever margin you're using. Actually, I think I did that slightly wrong. I think it's also let's see here. Um, Pardon me, I should have gotten this right. So this is going to be, actually, we're doing this times 3 because we're holding it for 3 days. And so your total margin cost, I believe if you're just going to use this amount of margin for 3 days, is going to be 6 cents. So your total cost is $59.24 to do this. Now the div is going to pay back $63. So you're paying your margin back immediately, and then you have some leftover change. Now, what I found when I was doing the math is this is the multiplier that gets added onto whatever you would normally get, and that's a per month. So your dividend gets multiplied by 1.0662653 blah blah blah. So not a huge amount, but I noticed that if you do this per month, so it's going to be that. Let's do this. What I ended up getting was 49.39, and I actually did the math wrong because this is not including 13 distributions in a year rather than 12. I used 12 as the benchmark. But this was the 2004 total dividend paid by YieldMax from MSTY. But if you use this strategy on a 12 distribution per year basis, you would end up with 49.39, and I can actually change the math. Let's do it times 13. You would actually end up with $51.21 this way. And really, like, pardon here, you could just use margin, and you could just, every time it pays out, you could increase your margin. But this is a way to reduce your risk. This reduces your risk of a margin call extraordinarily great, because each month you're only holding margin for 3 days, and it's a very conservative use of margin because you're only going to purchase the amount of shares that you're already going to get in the equivalent of a dividend. So you're basically capturing an additional multiplier effect. Like I said here, if I did the math right, this is the amount of multiplier of your dividend per month. And then if there's 13 distributions, you end up with, basically you not quite double your dividends, but you don't have long-term margin debt. You don't have the risk of a margin call and all of that. And you always have the option of not dripping all of your excess dividend back into the MSTY. You can just collect it. You can put it somewhere safer, like a fund like Week, WEEK, or you can put it in spot Bitcoin, which is pretty darn good as far as total return per year on average. So I hope this was interesting. Please feel free to critique my math because this is definitely a math-heavy technique, but it's very cool because it's lower risk than using margin generally. Because you're not only are you holding your margin for very short periods of time, so like over the course of 13 pay periods, you're only holding margin, like if we're just saying 3 days per pay period when you're doing the capture, you're holding 39 days out of 360 days, or whatever the total amount of trading days is per year. So you're reducing your time risk, you're reducing your capital risk because you're only using a very small amount of margin. And even if, like, on the day that there's a div payout or whatever, even if there's a huge drop in the NAV, you can just wait till the next pay period and pay that margin off with the next div, and you can withhold your div capture strategy that way. And it's a very awesome way to stay conservative but also put a multiplier on your dividend and use margin wisely in a way that's not going to make you lose your shirt and your lunch. So anyway, hope this was helpful. Thanks for tuning in. Leave a comment, like, and subscribe if this was cool.